Well,
as a Wikipedia editor, I disagree.
You know why he left?
You think it's pretty random?
Kesher Israel? Well, Kesher Israel in 1911 when it started was, it was very small. It was, and so he was the rabbi of several. He was rabbi here and of Shalom. These are on the Wikipedia page at the same time. In other words, these were Shtibloch, basically.
Okay.
I think they all were Shtibloch, most of them. The Reform synagogues were big. I'm sure Washington Hebrew was big. The conservative synagogues, I'm not even sure they existed yet, and although maybe Out of Israel existed.
But he was paid by synagogue.
So it's a little unclear because in some ways he seems to be the rabbi of synagogues at different times. Is the Rabbi of Kesher, of Shalom, later on at First Israel, but there are times when you get the sense that he's the rabbi of Washington. And you can see that when they honor him for his 25th anniversary, it's clear that he's like the rabbi of Washington. Although he and Rabbi Dubrow, who became the permanent rabbi of Kesher Israel he died in 44, I think. He was rabbi here for maybe 30 years. So he probably became the rabbi in the teens. Oh no, maybe in the 20s. And there's a picture on the web. If you Google Rabbi Silverstone, you'll see one of the main pictures. It's also on the Kesher website. Is of Rabbi Dubrow, Rabbi Silverstone, Rabbi Clevens, in a row, and they're sitting together.
Rabbi Cleven.
Cleven.
Oh yeah.
And maybe his children and grandchildren.
No, he married my parents.
Oh,
he was the rabbi of Shalom.
So that might have. I wonder if that was his son.
Oh.
I can't imagine that was. Because already in the teens, he's he's like 50. So, but there is a picture there, probably from the 20s or 30s. So Rabbi Dubrow already became the permanent rabbi of Kesher. I think in the 20s. But so a lot of these shuls, were like Shtibloch. Kesher obviously built a building, and they started to have buildings, in the 20s. So this was built in 31. But what's interesting is obviously his Torah itself is worth learning and is worth taking Musar from, and that's that's right. So he went to Israel several times. I mentioned this last time. Somebody online mentioned this. He went to Jaffa for like a year. He went to Tzfat. At one point he says, "I sold everything to make Aliyah." There was no state yet. This is like in the 30s. He said he sold everything, and his wife was ill, and they had to come back. And he really was most enough. There's a lot of self-sacrifice that he had for Israel.
Did he have U.S. citizenship?
I assume so. He came here from Belfast in 1905.
Belfast.
Yeah, he was rabbi of Belfast Hebrew Congregation, 1901. And he grew up in Liverpool, actually. Yeah, but he kept going back to Israel. In fact, Rav Kook there are approbations in some of his books from Rav Kook. There are also approbations in some of his books, letters from the White House, because he would send his book. It's a Hebrew book, but he would send it when he published it to the White House, to the president. And we're talking about like in the teens, 20s, and 30s. Like presidents were very accessible. They didn't have that much staff. They had a secretary who was really like what would now be the chief of staff. It was a political position, but he was actually the secretary. And so there are at least two, in the front of at least two of his books, there's a letter from the president's secretary. And it's not the administrative secretary, it's an appointed secretary to Rabbi Silverstone saying, thank you for the book. We were very interested in it, whatever. I'm sure the president, I think it was, at one point it was Wilson, and at another it was Taft. And we know who the person is signing it. It's a well-known name because he had been very high up in the government and then becomes like the personal secretary to the president. So there's several of those. They're in Hebrew. I can't imagine anybody in the White House could have read them, which is interesting.
Stuck them on a shelf or something. What do they do?
I don't know. It's I guess they cared about those. In the old days they cared about
when they
things.
have like some head of state they can show them.
Yeah, they, in those days, like you can find book. I once came across a book from the early part of the 20th century. It was on visiting the president. In other words, and you could just on Sunday, you could knock on the door and you could go visit the president.
Wow.
And, so it's, what to know when you do that. it's such a different world. I mean, and they didn't have a big staff until the early part of the 20th century. They had like one or two people that worked for them. That was it. No, it wasn't a different world. So, so
I
this.
guess it was a more difficult journey, especially like early 1800s to get here.
Oh yeah, yes, totally different. Yeah. So this actually is not a drasha on the high holidays. This is a drasha on Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I'm studying the land of Israel, and I'm kind of going in historical order. What we did last time was from the teens, and if you remember, his attitude was a pretty strong one. What's interesting is that you would think that he would become more sort of upset about Jewish life in America as time goes on, and as Jews kind of make it in America. But it actually seems to go kind of the other way, and you can judge for yourself. To me, it seems like he's sort of tougher in the teens and the 20s, and then by the 30s, he takes a kind of different, softer approach, actually, which I was not expecting it to go that way. I was expecting it to go the opposite way. But we'll see. This is from 1924. This is published in 1924, and you'll see that it does touch on tshuva, and it's also it's interesting in a historical way, also. So he says that we know that in the Torah, when the Jewish people came to the land of Israel, the children of Gad and the children of Reuven were very wealthy, and they had a lot of sheep, and they wanted to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan. And that's why they ended up living outside the technical land of Israel. I mean, where the border of the land of Israel is a little bit different when God talks to Abraham versus when God talks to Moshe and when Moshe talks to the Jewish people. But if you consider the Jordan the border of Israel, then the tribes of Reuben and Gad ended up being on the other side. And Moshe says to them, well, you have to come and wage war with us. You can't just, stay. And they say, of course we will. And then they wanted to go back because they had a lot of cattle. And the land on that side of the Jordan was the first land that the Jewish people encountered. And it was good for cattle because, of course, it's the plain of the river. He says, V'zeu Maka Yeshana. He says, this is an old plague. Sheyehudim ashirim chafetzim le'shev b'chutz. That wealthy Jews want to live outside of Israel. He says, this is an old story. Who wants to go to Israel? He says, the Jews who are poverty stricken. That's who wants to go to Israel. He's writing this in 1924. He says, and the poor in Israel, they have no way to make a living. He says, but the wealthy won't go to Israel. They have factories in America. And then they have to make places for their workers. Millionairim, if the wealthy would move to Israel, he says it would work so much better. But the millionaires don't want to. Yifnu makom. Oh, sorry. Let me read it over here because that way the people at home will be able to follow along. I apologize. Okay. It says, "Ma tova hi la'aretz asher avru aleha alpayim shana o maleah charvoti." He says, how great would it be in Israel if the wealthy went there? Ma tova ki rak anashim asher chfetzim le'ezrach olim shama. But now only those who need a place to live go there. Miuchal azaratam, and who can help them? If you give them what to live on, ma tov zelahem, it would be so much better. Yutav matzavam b'tmicha lanu aveira gedolah. He says, for us, this is a big sin. Hilolin devos ba'u shama ki'im la'avod b'yagiat apam. Says the people who go to Israel are going there, they're going there to work hard. But they can't find enough work. Rabbi of Kesher Israel. There's not enough money to support those in the land of Israel. We have to give the poor who need bread. Instead, they go to Israel and they say, wait, there'll be work. They're waiting for work. He says, we have the obligation to support them. So what happens to these wealthy people outside of Israel and America who stay in America? What happens is, the answer is their children intermarry. Right? We're talking about a generation of immigrants who came to America. And indeed, that's what happened, right? I mean, there were no yeshivas in America. There were these shuls that the Jews made, Orthodox shuls. But the Jews who came to America in the 1880s, 1890s, the Russian immigration of Orthodox Jews, I mean, it's almost unheard of for their children or grandchildren to have stayed religious. Very, very rare. Which is why most folks who are Orthodox today, either their ancestors came after the war, or somebody became a Baal Tshuva along the way. Somebody became religious along the way.
What about, all the Syrians?
No, that's different. I mean, the Sephardim came much later.
Didn't Syrians come like early 19th?
Really? To America?
That's when they went to like Argentina. No, when they went to Argentina.
I don't know. I mean, Sephardim are a bit of a different story because they didn't experience. Sephardim and Ashkenazim are culturally so different. Partly they didn't experience the Holocaust. They also didn't experience the European Enlightenment. They were from Muslim lands, which is a bit of a different story. Vapano Shalmar, Jacob Schiff Yochiach. So what is this Jacob Schiff? So there was this guy, Jacob Schiff, who was very wealthy, and his daughter intermarried. Let's look this up. And here he is. Jacob Henry Schiff. There's a Wikipedia page about him, like everybody. Somebody has to make a Wikipedia page about him. So he was, he died in 1920. He was a German-born Jewish-American banker, businessman, philanthropist. He helped finance expansion of the American railroads. So there was some kind of thing where he ends up, his daughter ended up intermarrying, some kind of big deal. I guess because intermarriage was not very common in those days. Be'eretz HaKadosha, he says, and this has not changed. He says, if you go to Israel, we know that our children are going to be ours. Our children are going to stay Jewish. That's what he said. I mean, he's writing this in 1924, right? It's funny, by the way. My daughter just made Aliyah. And one of the reasons she made Aliyah was a conversation we had in which we were talking about modern Orthodoxy. And I said, the truth is, I said, being modern Orthodox is very hard in America, especially for young people, because it's hard. It's hard to be in a country that's not a Jewish country, that's not an Orthodox place, and to be part of the world. And to do both is very hard. It's easy to be a Haredi in America, to be ultra-Orthodox in America, because you live in an insular environment. Obviously, it's easy to not be observant in America, but to be both is very hard. And I said, but what I'm seeing in America today is that young modern Orthodox people who are fervent about their religious observance are more and more moving to Israel. Aliyah among the young is, and so it's interesting. It in a certain sense, I mean, you see from the pandemic, right? Nothing's changed in 100 years. Same arguments we have about masks they had in San Francisco in 1918. Human beings don't really change, that much. Jews change, but they don't change. It's in the Torah. It says you'll give birth to children and they won't be yours, because that's what's happening in America. Is our children are being born, but they're not staying. They're not staying Jewish. Like in the story of Ruth, is on page 12. Elimelech, who leaves Israel because of the famine, and he goes into the plains of Moab. And Machlon and Kilian, his children. Now, of course, one of the people that they married turns out to be Ruth, so it's very good in the story. But they marry non-Jewish women. Aval ben shel Herbert Samuel. Who is Herbert Samuel? So he actually talks about Herbert Samuel more than once. Herbert Samuel was a British member of the House of Lords. He was Jewish, and he was the British, he had a British title in Israel. He was sort of like for the British government, kind of overseeing Israel. The exact name
So
of
the
his
British
title.
appointed a Jew to oversee Israel.
Yeah, although he was a member of the House of Lords. He was.
He did it from Israel if he lived.
So he was in London, but then he did go to Israel. Yeah. There's a hotel in Jerusalem. So yeah, he did go to, you'll see in a minute that he was in Israel. And I think there's actually a time when Rabbi Silverstone appeared when he was in Israel. I think he spoke at something with Herbert Samuel, and there was other great rabbis there. I'm also speaking. I remember what they were talking about. The issue was, it might have to do with Sabbath observance in the land of Israel at the time. I mean, this is before the state, obviously. And then he says, Abu Ben Shel Herbert Samuel Nasa Bat Malamed Tinokot. He says the son of Herbert Samuel, who wasn't so religious actually, but because he was in Israel, he married a Jewish person. V'erev Shabbos im Chashecha, when it's Friday afternoon in Israel, everybody looks at Harat Sofim at Mount Scopus. Now, I'm not sure if the university was there yet, but Herbert Samuel apparently had a house on Mount Scopus. The Shama Armon, there is the palace of Herbert Samuel. Samuel, when Mrs. Samuel lights the candles for Shabbat, everybody lights their candles because they're looking, as they can see in the palace window. It must have been a British, like ambassador's residence or something. And so he says, here's the Orthodox people come to America and they assimilate. And in Israel, the people who are not so religious, they go there and just the opposite happens. They cleave more to their religion. America. See the difference between the wife of Chatzkel, the tailor from America. I don't think it's a specific person anymore, general term. That she doesn't light the candles for Shabbos at all. And the difference between that and Herbert Samuel. Sof hadavar haya kamoshim Simon Medrash. It's like the Medrash says, Leficha chalut tchila mikol hashvatim miocholitein arevot ki'ela asher mityachasim el hagoyim b'ashlich ol eretz hakodesh. Avol re'u na mahu hachayim po. He says, but see what life is in America. Hey mazvu et Torah Yisrael. They've given up the Torah of the Jewish people. V'rak al sir habasar yitnu et pneim. What is so tempting about America? The answer is money. The pot of flesh that we have in America. Don't we see that there's only death there? It poisons us, this pot of flesh in America. And nobody will remember them. We basically are losing our way in America. And this generation that's growing up in America, he says, their children are like young infants that are taken as captives among the nations, and they know nothing about Judaism. What will be with them? These immigrants, the Jewish people in America, have given their children everything they could. All of the pleasures of the world. But they have not raised their children to study Torah, and to be involved in Torah, and to be involved in Judaism. To understand the wisdom of the Jewish people. They have chased after vanity. Malahem v'la emuna. Halo avotem kvar hitbolelu, ve'ela asher lo hitbolelu od. Heim yavozu b'libam shem Yisrael. They are forsaking the name Israel. V'yavoshu im yodei adarik im imei Yisrael yatzu. Do they even know that they're Jews? V'habanim ha'ela sheyeglu below amuna v'fkeros. They're growing up without any faith. What's going to be with them? Amaisa sa'aruya shel Chicago Yochiach. I'll tell you what's happening with them. Look at what happened in Chicago. You'll see in a second. So he writes in a very dramatic way, right? So and you could see. But the truth is, even as 100 years ago, the Musar is still important Musar for us. Like it's we have achieved much more wealth than Rabbi Silverstone ever could have imagined, right? Jews have it in a certain sense very easy in America. It's perhaps more. It's funny, I met a guy at the coffee shop yesterday, and I was waiting for somebody to have a meeting with, and I was wearing my yarmulke and I didn't have a hat on, and this old Jewish guy at a table says to me, "You want a place? Sit here." So I sat down and we start talking, because I had about 10 minutes for my meeting, and he says, "Oh yeah, I went to Kesher Israel a long time ago," and he I can't remember how I got on. I can't remember what I was going to say about him.
So
But
you sat at the table, he was going to tell you something.
yeah, and I'm trying to remember how it connected to what I was trying to say.
We're talking about
Oh, wealth in America. Yeah. So that's the thing, right? In other words, Jews, they came to America. Yeah. Oh, so we have all of this, right? We have so much.
But the issue of wealth is no longer a big difference between American and Israel.
It was anti-Semitism. That's what it was. So he said to me, when I was young, he said, in the 40s, he's a doctor. He said there was tremendous anti-Semitism. And he said, people think it's different today. It's no different. It's the same anti-Semitism. I was trying to argue maybe it's slightly different anti-Semitism, but he thought it was the same. So in a way, I mean, what Rabbi Silverstone is crying out about, that it was difficult for the Jewish people, but they're making a lot of money, and their Judaism is falling on the back burner. So it's not as true for us because we have day schools. They didn't have day schools.
And also because Israel is doing well economically too.
That's true. But and I'm not saying that going to Israel is an elixir for Jewish life. Is an elixir for Jewish life. I don't think it's the solution for Jewish life necessarily. If you go to Israel, I'm still not really be passionate about it. But I'm not sure that the challenges actually of America have really changed in 100 years. Yeah.
I can roll.
Please.
If we remember, though, there were issues in the same thing about having wealthy people inside of Israel back in the days of the invasion of the Seleucids.
Okay.
What do we get with
the
the
Pharisees?
Maccabees? The Maccabees dealing with not just Greeks, but other Jews who were trying to.
Sure. No, you're right. Hellenization, and that's true.
But if you remember which ones were the Hellenized, it was specifically people who could afford Greek and
not surprising.
Things like that.
Not surprising, right? Right. So we have, more than anybody could have ever imagined, obviously. But again, the Bali Musar, those who give rebuke and those who help us to do tshuva, they've always pointed out that everything is a challenge. Poverty is a challenge. Wealth is a challenge, right? That's the joke. So it's not easy. I'll tell you, we have a congregant here. It's one of the most powerful and most wealthy probably Jews in America. He's a congregant. He comes here every day to daven. He's one of the most humble people I've ever met. And he'll drive half an hour to go to a minyan. He doesn't have to. Like, nobody's watching over him, and he owns lots of, he owns more than 2 houses, and I'm just amazed. Like, I think to myself, if I had the money and the power he had, would I be able to to resist the temptations of all that? And would my central concern really be to come and daven? Like, that's everything is its own nisayon. Everything is its own test, and you have to sort of take inspiration from that.
Kesher has a bit of a history. There was Joe Lieberman, there was Jack Booth.
Yeah. Right. These are powerful people, right? But they are concerned with their own spiritual life. Sure.
Rob, it's not just how much power you have. There's also the argument, the more, the higher spiritual level you have, the more your Yetzer Hara is.
Sure, right. It can be true also. Yeah.
Now, there is one thing in that lots of people come to DC because of sense of public service, and lots of the top people in the government are doing sense of public service, and a lot of people who are really driven by public service are also thoughtful, spiritual. They think about ethics.
Sure.
So there might be a correlation with being.
They do think about ethics, but there's also a lot of nisayon. I think there can also be a big test. It can itself be a big test. So so humans change, but they really don't. The same challenges are still here that Rabbi Silverstone's talking about. So what's going on in Chicago? He says, Shnei bachurim shel Yehudim, ashirim hargunar Yehudim. There were 2 Jewish lads who were wealthy, killed another Jew. Lo bad kesef, it wasn't for money. Ki kesef rabahim, they had a lot of money. Lo bad ezadavar shahaya lahem sina lanar, they didn't hate the lad. Imhem tamu mikol hatovos ba'olam, they had everything. Aval ba'achas lo tamu, there's one thing they hadn't tasted. What was that? Murder. V'chein tifsu etanar, they kidnapped the lad. Asher lahaya lahem sina klal, they didn't hate him at all. Lanara umlo v'rachtoto, he didn't hate them. So he says, when they were brought to justice, it's not only them who were being brought before the court, but their ancestors, their father, their parents. Get Toabas B'nehem Asher Asu. So what's he talking about? He's talking about Leopold and Loeb. You know about this? So in the 20s, I think, there were these two kids in Chicago, sort of like Ayn Rand kind of thing, and they wanted to commit the perfect crime. The problem was they had everything, and they wanted more. So they thought they would commit the perfect crime. They kidnapped a kid and murdered him, and in their own minds, they had some bizarre, egotistical, fantasy. And
they were both Jewish.
They were both Jewish, and they were brought to justice. Ultimately, it was actually not a very perfect crime at all, but terrible act.
How old were they?
They were. You can Google it. It's pretty well known. I think there's even been movies made about it.
Lowell and
Leopold and Loeb.
And then what happened to them?
There you go. Oh, actually, one of them lived till the 70s. They were 19 and 18. Thank you. And if you Google it, you'll see a whole thing about it. There's a lot about it. What happened to them? So one of them was brought to justice. They were both brought to justice. I think one of them died very early on, and one of them lived till 66 years old.
He died in jail?
Yeah, I think he died in jail. I think so.
And they just
Not sure if he got out to read it.
guy?
What?
They just found a random guy they didn't know.
Yeah, it was like a kid who was coming home from school or something. His name, but you can see Rabbi Silverstone is really.
And this is like a big scandal in the whole country.
Oh yeah. It was. Yeah, there was some movie.
Did it give a bad name, like a Chil Hashem to Jews?
So that's a good question. To what extent?
Or did the press not really talk about that?
I don't know. I have to take a look. But certainly Rabbi Silverstone feels like he just, he sees this as a sort of a disease of America. That when you have too much, there's, you always want the next exciting thing. Now we have drugs and things, so you don't need to. But no, it's a real issue for people, right? If people are not driven by ideas and ideals, then people get bored. That's the thing about Judaism. Right? One of my kids once said to me, he said, the great thing about being an observant Jew is you always have something to do. We have a constant mitzvah to study Torah, right? We're always, you're never not busy. Like you're never, whatever time you're sitting and not studying Torah, you have to have an accounting for why. There's a constant mitzvah to study Torah. It's not easy, but, I'm not saying there's no room to do anything else, but it requires thought. What is a person has to always be asking, as I mentioned from Sharm the other day on Shabbos, what is our obligation in the world? Why am I here? The Gemara says every day should be the day before your last. You should get up and think about, if this is my last day, what would I do? So that once or twice I've tried that. It doesn't necessarily last all day, but it lasts an hour, and what you do, it changes what you do a little bit. And because that's the reality of life. As we all have this fantasy that we're in charge and that we're in control, but we're really not. People die in the blink of an eye. These are appropriate things for, this is what Elul is about. This is what the high holidays are about. That's why in Kippur we dress as if we wear white. And that's how we bury a person, wearing white. And we don't eat, we don't drink. It's like a kind of death experience goes on in Yom Kippur. Hopefully a rebirth, but that's the thing. It gets us in touch with fasting, gets us in touch with the frailty of the human being, and that makes us really think about, what's our, takes us away from the comfort that we take in feeling in control. So I think that's part of what he's saying here is that I mean, he sees it he's sort of blaming America for it, but it is partly true. I mean, he's saying like, where are the values? The values are so messed up. They had tried everything in the world, and that they hadn't done, so they had to do. He says, and it's not only them who were being brought to justice, but their ancestors. I think he's saying the Jewish people. The from
a religious background.
No, I don't think they were particularly religious. But in those days, nobody was that removed from. How many generations before was it that their ancestors came from? It couldn't have been that many. So he says, "L'shav lachem livkot lishpoch sicha, l'shav lachem lishpoch kaf limrod chayechem ba'ad b'nechem." He says, don't just cry. Atem ha'avot enechem chayvim b'davar. He said, if you have children, you're obligated to. You have to take on the obligation. Atem hamitem et b'nechem misa olamit. If you're not educating your children, then you're ending their Jewish life. And this also impacts not only their children, but also the people of the Jewish people. All the money that we spend for frivolous things, and on our children, it's left them bereft. Spiritually, morally bereft. And it desecrates the name of the Jewish people in the eyes of the non-Jews. It's the Chil Hashem part. And what could you have done, he says, with all of that money? He says to the parents of Leopold and Lo, you could have helped Israel. You could have settled the land of Israel. That's what you could have done, right? And we're talking about in the 20s, right? In the 20s, what are they trying to do? They're trying to buy the land of Israel, trying to send money to those who are trying to live in the land of Israel. I mean, at that time, in 28, of course, there's a massacre in Hebron, and there are some Arab riots that are going to be coming on the scene. But at that time, Israel is more of a swamp than anything, and people are trying to live there, and they need resources. And so he says, the Americans here are having a good time, but their children are bereft morally and spiritually, and they could have spent it supporting Israel. He says, make an accounting of your souls on Ashim Keila millionaires, Leopold Velob. The millionaires like Leopold and Loeb, they haven't given anything. And look, that's the price they pay. They're not giving to yeshivas and to shuls of Israel. He says at least they should give it to the university in Israel. I guess Hebrew U was already there. And then their children at least would study. With the professors there, it's interesting, right? He says, okay, maybe I can't expect you to give to the yeshivas and go to Israel, but at least you could give money to Hebrew U, and your children will study there and become professors. If you give to the land of Israel, you'll be written forever. Divrei Yisrael in the annals of the Jewish people. And you'll be known as somebody who gives to the Jewish people. And maybe they'll even call the university on your name, by your name. I guess you must have about Hebrew U. I think that's all there was. He says, quoting the Talmud here, there are those who acquire their world to come in 1 hour. But they didn't do that. They could have given their money to the right places, but they didn't do it. And so their values were misplaced.
Sometimes, though, that message can be twisted because there are lots of people who either they just give lots of money and they think that's the only
right. It can be an excuse,
and they don't do anything else.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're definitely people, not necessarily always American, but they're not good people. They can be like mobsters, and they give lots of money.
That's true. To
charity, and it's sort of they use it. What's called like trust. reputation washing.
PR.
right. But
like,
sometimes, Jews will give
or
that
reputation
money.
laundering.
But sometimes Jews
Yeah.
will give that money to to the symphony and to other things because they want a name among the peers they want to be peers with. Why aren't they giving it to Jewish causes? The answer is they don't want to be too Jewish. I mean, it's less of an issue now because Jews have made it in America. I mean, every high up political family has Jews, if not Orthodox Jews in it. Every wealthy family has Jews in it. I mean, this is new. That's to become a Jew today in America is not so crazy. 100 years ago, it was insane. Says, so then he writes here in the last paragraph, says, Shirei America, wealthy ones of America, wealthy Americans, Lama tini'un et lev achechem. Why are you giving pain to the heart of your brethren? Haim lo tedu ki bazeh atem machlishim et lev hamishtokakim l'chibat afar artzenu. Don't you know that you're weakening the hearts of those who want to cleave to our land? Gerotem ha'ashirim omdim u'mityachsim b'karirut. You should do your obligation. Be chalutzim, be pioneers. Okay. So that's 1924. And again, his messages are timely messages, even if historically they're kind of in a different era.
Now, by the way,
Yeah.
So the 1910s were like a big time of activism, like in America, right? Like idealistic, like labor movement, progressivism, like women's rights, Teddy Roosevelt's like whole like environmentalism. But I guess this was a bit after that.
This is 1924.
Like this is after.
I mean, it's interesting also to think about as he comes to the end of the 20s.
I think like a lot of that went away with World War I. Like there was a big disillusionment.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Well, I'm sure that's true, right? It was a terrible war, World War I. War to end all wars, which it wasn't. Not at all. All right, I'm going to do another piece.
If you don't mind my asking.
Yeah.
Given that this country does have a big root in, like, the founding of this country is inseparable from Jewish involvement. Haim Solomon, for instance. You guys are familiar with the name.
Yeah. Like, there's a lot of evidence that Alexander Hamilton was halachically Jewish.
I believe it, but Haim Solomon was one of the big financiers of the revolution, who was a big proponent. Was a big proponent for religious liberty, specifically to allow Jewish people to be able to live here. I don't see it being necessarily too far-fetched for people in Eastern Europe seeing the pogroms they're going through, and all else to say, well, at the very least, this is a country that you're not going to be killed in.
Here,
like these.
Well, that's true. Jews came here, I think, for safety. Sure. I think that's true. So this is a book called Otzer.
I don't know.
Like he openly talked about the fact he went to a Hebrew school and learned Gemara, and it looks like his biological mom, was married to someone who's clearly Jewish.
Alexander Hamilton?
Yeah, and
That was
like,
not in the musical.
Yeah.
yeah, it was not. But I mean, he openly like told his kids about growing up going to a Hebrew school and
Really?
for
That's shocking.
Huh.
Where did he grow up?
he
Philadelphia?
in the Caribbean.
Oh, wow.
And
Where was
apparently
it? Oh, funny, I
25%
just
of the
heard
population
about
there
that.
was Jewish.
Yeah, I just heard that.
But apparently he was born out of wedlock,
Yeah.
and apparently his biological mom's husband was Jewish, and the Danish did not allow intermarriage, which suggests that she probably either converted or something. I mean, like, it's a circumstantial evidence. It's like not, you could be non-Jewish and going to a Hebrew school, and your father-in-law can be Jewish, but your mom not be Jewish.
Was there a Hebrew school in the
Nevis.
Caribbean?
Yeah, so Nevis apparently was 25% Jewish. Anyways, that's.
Yeah. So I want to look at something from 1936.
Oh, and for instance, Alexander Hamilton never took communion. Made a point of never taking
Oh, that's
communion.
interesting.
He avoided going to church.
Huh.
He like went out of his way to defend, like, to speak out against anti-Semitism.
Wow.
Anyways,
That's cool.
How are you feeling, guys?
Okay.
Wish I
We'll
would
see.
have
No
heard a little
problem.
bit
No
before.
problem. I'm taping it from.
Just our Paul to keep me informed.
Okay, so this is from 1930, Tavish Peva, 1936. And what I want to show is how he sort of changes over time a little bit. You'll see he's very tough here, but once we get into the 30s, I feel like he changes a little bit. So this is interesting. This is a drasha for Rosh Hashanah, and he has an interesting metaphor that he uses. He says sometimes when we come to Shul on Rosh Hashanah, it's like this guy who went to the house of a wealthy person. And he saw there that the wealthy person has a bell under there. They have a foot pedal under their table that rings an electric bell. And when they ring the electric bell, the servants come and they bring the food. I had congregants in St. Louis, I had a very old house in St. Louis, and there was still a bell under the table, actually, an electric bell. And
Did it work?
I don't know, I think it worked, actually.
Did you use
I mean, we pressed it, but the servants didn't come. So that's exactly what he says here. He says, and this guy goes home to his wife and he says, listen, I got it. I got an answer to our problems. This poor guy says, I was at the wealthy person's house and I'm going to solve our problems. So what does he do? He installs a bell under the table and he rings the bell and he waits and nothing comes. And his wife says to him, Yishmenjik. It's not the bell that brings the food. It's the wealthy guy that has a servant to cook the food and the bell just. So he says, that's the chauffeur. You know, he says, Kain Rabosai, this is, no, so this is 1926. This is 26. And somebody was saying that Rabbi Dura was in Israel. That's right. I think Rabbi Dura was in Israel in 36, in 37, and maybe he came back. But 26, I think he's here. So, so he says, so to us, my friends, he says, we say, Zachreinu l'chaim, God, remember us for life. Remember us for good life. Write us in the book of all the things that we need. So he says, that's like ringing the bell. Lahavi et asherachinu. That only brings us what we've prepared throughout the month of Elul. We're asking God to give us what we've already prepared. Throughout the year, through our good deeds and through our Torah study and through our tzedakah, through our charity that we've given to the poor and to the synagogues and to those who are ill and to help people. And he says, if we haven't done that all year, if Rosh Hashanah is just, like popping in once a year, that's like ringing the bell and expecting, that something's been prepared, but you haven't prepared it all. That's the year, he says, and I think that's also, it's very, very fitting for Elul, because the month of Elul, of course, is preparation for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That's why Sfardim say get up early every day of Elul, and they say Slichot, petitionary prayers, and Ashkenazim blow the shofar every day of Elul. In the morning, we're blowing the shofar because it's supposed to wake us up. Maimonides says that blowing the shofar it wakes us up to do tshuva, it wakes us up to repent. And so the shofar is just and the prayers, they're just the bell. And then he writes, and this is very tough. He says there's something worse. He says we say in one of the prayers, we say we are like the poor person, the needy person is coming to you, God. We don't come with any deeds, we don't come with anything, we're just knocking on your door, God. And then he says, but he says, he says, we're asking from God. And he says, but we have done our business throughout the year. And the work that we've done throughout the year in our business, our business is treif. He says it's a contraband. He says, we're cheating in our business, and there's chilul shah, we're violating Shabbos publicly, and we're eating non-kosher, and we're not going to the mikvah, and our children are not receiving any chinuch, any Jewish education, and there's sinat chinam, there's hatred, and there's lashon hara, there's bad talk. Mutav shelo l'daber, it's better if we don't speak at all. He says, please, he says to the crowd, examine your deeds. Believe me, he says, you will find what I'm talking about. In fact, there's even more that I can't say. I mean, it's an interesting question. What's he referring to, right? This is 1926. I don't know. Has he got mobsters in the congregation? Does he? I mean, he's talking about the Jews selling contraband. He's talking about.
Talking about the prohibition.
Oh, maybe that's what it's 26th prohibition. Oh,
He was
that's
still in the DC
interesting.
area.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe sorry.
I don't know. That's a good question. So it's interesting. Obviously immigrants, had a hard time, and sometimes there was, I think, you got to make it in any way you can. But he is clearly beside himself about this. This is very powerful language. Besides the spiritual things, is that he's crying out about, which is Shabbos.
Someone like tips the World Series in Chicago.
Oh, really? Funny.
But I think that was like a few years.
Yeah.
There's the.
Yeah. In New York, there were Jewish mobsters in the 26th. So several.
Probably here too.
It could be.
Although
Probably Washington.
You don't hear about too many mobsters.
You don't
down
hear
in
about
Washington.
Washington. They were using different methods. I don't know.
They were good.
Yeah, no, that's true. Look, we think about the Italians when we think about organized crime, but Jews were
Well, the Nazi
unfortunately
Russians.
pretty involved. Yeah, no, but 20s. We all know the names. I remember when I was living in New York, there was a like a kosher restaurant. And they named it after
Bugsy.
Meyer Lansky. I thought that's such a chutzpah. It was so distasteful to me. He murdered people.
Yeah.
You may have this sort of, idealized image of these folks, but they were murderers. And it very much bothered me.
Often people talk about like Bugsy in like a positive way.
Right. No, he was,
He was like very didn't the press like portray him as this very glamorous?
Well,
Jewish
sometimes they
monster?
were glamorous. The Italians were also glamorous, but it doesn't, you have to. Rabbi Silverstone he is true. He sees through, he really tells like it is. And he says, even the little good that we have is mixed in with, the dregs. A filter, and he says when, he has this image of God sort of putting our deeds to a filter. He says it's not going to do too well. So he's very strong in these things. When it comes to doing something that is, either between us and God, or between us and other people, lashon hara and other things, or not doing business faithfully. Honestly, he really is giving it to people, and he's obviously being faced with. I don't think this is coming out of nowhere. Right, when somebody writes like this, it means they're reacting to something. I'll just read the end of it. He says, "Alkain, therefore, my master says, Tem batem hayom Rosh Hashanah b'Beis HaMikdash ma'at." He says, "You've come to the small temple today on Rosh Hashanah to get from God, goodness for you and for your families. Kol zeh taliyah hapam." And this all depends on the work that you do before Rosh Hashanah. It says if you pour out your hearts, that can make a difference. Today, before the great judge, maybe if we repent, it will help. So, tear your hearts, bring yourself close, cry, and depend, and he finishes with, hopefully we'll have a good year. But he's really beside himself about what's going on.
Whether this after he came back from Israel.
This is he went to Israel in 24 for about half a year, and then he did come back. So this isn't, he sort of moved to Israel, but it was, he had been in Israel for a couple of years before. But the metaphor is a proper one. We can't have this attitude that we sometimes feel. I think even Orthodox Jews sometimes feel this, that we're in shul. Why are we in shul on Rosh Hashanah Kippur? Want to hedge our bet. If we have a bad year, we don't want it to be our fault. At least we want to shul, So it doesn't work that way. It's not not sort of a one night thing. It's person. It that's why we have a whole month of Elul, and it's hard because Elul we don't always think about Elul. Elul sort of slips by. That's why we build a shofar, but Shuva, transformation, examining ourselves and our deeds. I mean, this is Herbert Silverstone saying. This is something that has to be all year. It can't just be for the high holidays. It has to be something that we're constantly engaged in. Or really, what is it? It's just. Okay, so next time will be our last class on this, and we'll look at a book of his called Kol Shofar, The Sound of the Shofar from 1930, and there's a couple essays in there that I want to look at. And you'll see it's sort of his language and his sense sort of changes a little bit. And they'll have to ask the question of why. You'd think it would get worse over time. Why does it get better? Let's see. Okay.
Maybe he just became like more realistic.
So that's what I was sort of thinking, is that maybe he's like you're passionate at the beginning, but after a while, when you can't change the world, you try and do what you can. He also in the 30s, I think, is much more looking toward Israel. There's a certain point, and we'll see this essay. There is a certain point at which he says, Jewish life in America is not going to work. He says we need to go to Israel. There's a different point at which he goes to Israel. Actually, in 1924, when he goes to Israel, he comes back and he writes, wow, they're not keeping Shabbos in Israel. So if you're not going to keep Shabbos in Israel, it's better to live in America. But then another time, he gets frustrated in America and he says, we should move to Israel. America has no Jewish future. So he's a real person. He goes back and forth. But
what do you think he would say now about America?
Look, I mean, Jewish life in America, I think today has much more Torah, has much more, you really have the ability to keep everything. I mean, you can do both today. You can have it all. But it's not easy. I don't think it's so easy. I think that in many ways, in many ways, for modern Orthodox Jews, I think Israel is much more fitting. It's not an easy life there, not at all. But
Depends what you're doing.
Yeah, well, that's true. It's good in high tech, I guess. But the economy is not so simple there. People get paid less and things cost more. Life is easy in America, but easier. But in many ways, I think living an observant life in Israel is more conducive. I do think that. I don't think it's as dire as it was in his time in America. Because again, you have much stronger Orthodox communities here. I mean, in a million years, they would never have imagined, New York, Teaneck, Silver Spring. I mean, you have everything. It's easy in some ways. But in other ways, the general culture is not a Jewish culture. Even in Israel, though it's in some ways a secular country, it's a Jewish country, and in many ways, it's also a religious country. That's.
Because in Israel, it's like built into the country.
Yeah,
and
in
like
some
here,
ways,
it feels like it's kind of.
I think it's a
polarized.
challenge here. I think it's hard here. I think it's look, if you're being single in downtown Washington, I think it's harder than being married in Silver Spring or Teaneck. I think that's a little bit more of a concern. But I mean, here you're living. There's challenges. I think it's hard. It's hard. I see it with the young people in the show. I see it with my own kids. It's not easy. But in some ways, in Israel, it's I don't know if it's just because there's a larger concentration of Jewish people, or if it's because, you, in a certain way, religion, even though it's sort of a secular country, religion was built in many ways. Like you go to the army, you have to be able to be religious in the army. Just built in. Shabbat is everyone's day. It's not easy. You don't get Sunday off.
Because here, like Christianity was built in. And
Oh yeah, no, this is a Christian country. Yeah.
Now in Israel, it depends a lot where you're living. Like if you're in Givat Shmuel, and you're like a modern Orthodox Dati-Leumi, it's very easy.
Yeah.
But if you're in Tel Aviv, it's much harder.
Okay, although Tel Aviv today is more religious than it was. Like when I was a kid, it was hard to find a kosher restaurant in Tel Aviv. Now it's not so hard. There's more, and there's, but even secular life, even secular Jews in Israel are not so secular. That's what I found. A lot of them, first of all, half of them are Sephardim. Sephardic Jews, even they don't have the same divisions that we have, and everybody's sort of, religious. And even among Ashkenazic Jews, because you also don't have, you had anti-religious movements in Israel, like the Shomer Tzair, the socialist movements. These were anti-religious movements. They were Jewish movements, but they were anti-religious movements. Well, hard to understand. But those things are not as powerful anymore. You just don't, that didn't last. That ideology of, we're going to build the land on the anti-religious socialist movement just didn't work. The kibbutzim have become privatized. And the people who are idealistic are religious people. The people who are making aliyah are not socialists. They could be socialists, but they're not moving because they're anti-religious socialists. They're moving because they're religious. The religious people are the people I think who are making aliyah. I'm not talking about the Russian aliyah. It's a little different. But people who are idealistically making aliyah, these are religious people. These are, the people Okay. I wish everybody a good week.
By the way, Rabbi, I saw an article that I found interesting. The question